2 weeks after Project Zomboid finalized their Build 41 update with multiplayer, Indy Stone started leaving hints and clues as to what Build 42 and beyond would look like. In this video, I'm going to attempt to piece it all together for you so we can have a better impression of what's to come with Project Zomboid Build 42, Build 43, and beyond. I'm also going to offer some thoughts as to where it's headed and prognosticate that question we all have in our minds. When will Build 42 release? But first, what are you most excited about for the next few Project Zomboid builds? I'd love to see your thoughts. Leave them in a comment below if you have any. On January 6, 2022, the Indy Stone released their 2022 and Beyond Thursdoid, in which they started talking very freely about what's next after Build 41's multiplayer update. In this article, we were given our first taste of what Build 42 would look like, and they were kind enough to throw up a fancy graphic for illustration. In the article, it looked like the plan was not to implement NPCs, or at least not NPCs as most imagined them into Build 42, but instead expand out crafting sections of the game first. The graphic shows a build roadmap all the way up to Build 48 with NPCs done in stages. The most surprising part of this announcement, in my opinion, was the crafting part, which Indy Stone really hadn't touched on before. We will really dig into that later on, because if they actually pull all the things they are wanting to pull off in this game, it could make Project Zomboid perhaps the best simulation game ever. Never mind the best zombie simulation game, which in my mind they already own. We will start with NPCs, as this has been, outside of multiplayer, the most requested feature since work on Project Zomboid started. It will also likely fall outside of Build 42, although Indy Stone has indicated that animals, which are technically NPCs, will drop about the same time as crafting, which is probably the beginning stages of NPCs anyway. In a recent article interview by NME, Lemmy lamented that NPCs are both the things we get the most hype about, people wanting, and the most criticism for the fact that we don't have them. Indy Stone did try NPCs early in game development with the story of Kate and Baldspot, which was a story mode to help new players with game mechanics. They also had NPCs in the actual game early on, which I never got a chance to play. According to their wiki, NPCs would have to consume food and water to survive. They would scavenge buildings and fortified shelters. They would have traits and occupations. Some would be hostile, some not, and others could join up with the player to form a community. Pretty much all you would expect from a world with NPCs. However, both Kate and Baldspot's story mode, as well as the NPCs, would be pulled from the game due to, as the wiki states, bugginess. The bugginess can be seen by various NPC mods made for Project Zomboid throughout the years. The complication is having 10, 20, or 30 semi-autonomous NPCs doing stuff outside of the player's worldview. As a side note, in 2014, Lemmy wrote a great article on the complexities of NPC development called Behavior Trees for AI, How They Work, in which he talked about the challenges of making NPCs autonomous enough to be believable in-game. Link is in the description below for anyone interested. Around the same time, 2014-2015, in an interview, Lemmy gives us the first clue as to his vision of NPCs in the Zomboid universe. When asked about exactly how advanced NPCs would be, Lemmy says this: "Advanced is a loaded question. We'll make them as advanced as we possibly can, and may subtly cheat to accomplish our goals to make up any remaining distance the NPC intelligence can't deal with alone. NPCs will form relationships with you and each other, and these will be altered by events that transpire in-game. This kind of stuff is not the behavioral AI stuff we've demoed in the previous videos, but more soft-scripted branching story event chains. The soft-scripted branching story event chains is something that will come up later and lead us into the heart of what a Project Zomboid world with NPCs will eventually look like." Lemmy goes on to say, if you look at Crusader Kings 2, you'll see a rather clever way of handling all this character-driven stuff that we've been heavily inspired by. It's essentially a combination of behavior trees defining the NPC's movement and moment-to-moment decision-making, while the NPC's main story and moral choices, decisions are played on a higher, simpler world model involving character traits and relationships, with events modifying these and triggering dialogue. The level we're aiming for is higher than in any game we can think of, truth be told. So with all the history out of the way, what is Indy Stone's plans for NPCs now, and what will they look like? Well, we can look no further than February 2022, when Lemmy dropped a bombshell on his Twitter talking about how the zombie world would be shaped in terms of NPCs at the start of each new game. In a series of tweets, he states, "So before game start, I'm generating a ton of families, starting with grandparents, giving them children, marrying the children to other families' children, then I divorce some of the parents. Then I'm remarrying, marrying, or making a single people partners, then giving them potentially more kids, just getting the basics of family connections. Then I split them all into households, grandparents living likely alone, older children move out into their own place, fiancés or partners maybe move in together. Then I assign each household a random house on the map to live with sufficient bedrooms that becomes their start safe house. Finally, I pick random events of people from each household to be away from home when everything is kicked off, splitting family units up across the map as some are at work, college, or whatever. The people away from their home are given the goal of getting back to their loved ones. The people at home will be hiding in their home, perhaps considering fleeing if they're all together. Then we kick off the meta sandbox. NPCs may have a burning need to find a loved one. They may arrive home to see them all as zombies, so on. The idea here is for realistic ties between characters to exist. This will factor into the NPC stories, giving them existing relationships. Every character will have a story at the start of the game. So the Zomboid game begins with a world that is teeming with life and connections, with some NPCs being motivated to head home, others already at home, some at work, but all with a rudimentary purpose depending on their current situation. Each with their own evolving story, contextual to what is going on at the time. On a side note, we already have a taste of this, albeit without the NPC flavor, with the various roadside camping and household stories in Build 41. What makes this interesting is that you could technically have an unlimited amount of NPCs doing their thing, but how do you solve the problem of all the resources, hundreds of NPCs doing their thing throughout Knox County? And this is where the story gets interesting. In another Thursdoid, Indy Stone further elaborated on this metaverse and how NPCs will interact with the world. They go on to say the metaverse is about creating a simplified and abstracted world outside the streamed-in player that they exist in, like a complex choose-your-own-adventure book with each NPC, with in-game context and numerous aspects of the character's involved personality, skills, or situation, determines which page it jumps to next. Indy Stone goes on further. We create a library of events that can trigger under different conditions. Each of these events and choices given to the NPC will be associated with a line of context, customizable dialogue that reflects said character recounting these events to the player in the future. For example, imagine a character is moving between their safe house and a building they plan to loot, and they move within range of another character within the meet. We maybe have a 2 NPC meet trigger that could randomly launch a story event. Does one shoot the other and loot their body? Do they join forces and ultimately become friends? Does one tell the other to find out where their safe house is? This is how we can have quite complex interactions between NPCs, and there's practically no AI involved whatsoever. The no AI part is interesting because it essentially frees up all the CPU space that would otherwise be allotted to NPCs' comings and goings physically in-game, and allows Zomboid to potentially create rich storylines in the background while the player is playing. For example, imagine seeing a couple NPCs or even having an interaction with them at one point of the game and then re-meeting them a month into gameplay, but this time, one is missing their partner and with a bandaged hand. The potential storylines could be as infinite as Indy Stone wants, depending on how much time they are willing to invest on event chains. And if this ever becomes a thing that modders can add into, look out. In the Lone Survivor Thursdoid, we learned that the events created can be complicated with branching chains depending on what happens in what they call the metaverse. Indy Stone explains how these stories or events can play out in the background while the player is playing their character. According to the post, each of these sentences trigger events that happen in the background while the player is playing. The events are all done in real time, so when this group tries to take Annie to the hospital, they are literally driving down a road in-game trying to take Annie to the hospital. At any point, the events could be interrupted if the player happens upon the group. The narrative could also be random in terms of what happens next, so technically, if the event system created is robust, there'll be very few times in which a player would see the same narrative, much like a choose-your-own-adventure. As Indy Stone explains it, narratives have natural endpoints that can end that narrative, or instead they potentially lead naturally into another if relevant. In other cases, they can set flags on characters or groups that will lead to other events or even other narratives, having a chance of triggering on them in the future. This is the way the narratives can ultimately serve as larger building blocks to make longer character stories that flow into each other convincingly. So the question is when? Well, I don't have an answer to this. I do know that NPCs have been a work in progress since probably 2014, maybe earlier, when they abandoned the Kate and Baldspot story, and this Thursdoid gives us the best clue as to how close they are to finishing NPCs enough to ship. Some 80% of this NPC build leans towards writing and designing of events and dialogue. The hardest technical aspects that success or failure rest on are mostly years behind us. This implies that in the least, the actual behavior aspects of NPCs, opening, closing doors, looting, and how the NPC would react to the player are, for the large part, done. The storylines and events associated with NPCs are likely still a work in progress. Personally, I don't suspect that human NPCs would drop in Build 42, although Indy Stone has surprised me in the past. But that said, I do like where they're headed. Well, that's a wrap for this video. Let me know in the comments what you are most excited about with this upcoming build, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see part 2 of the Project Zomboid Build 42 What We Know series. Leave a thumbs up on your way out. Until next time, goodbye, y'all.